In the early hush of a winter morning, when hospital hallways still smell like disinfectant and unfinished prayers, Dr. Sarah Chin walked with a kind of tired determination that only comes from losing more patients than she could ever admit out loud, her footsteps echoing through the aging population clinic she had inherited from a mentor who believed that saving people didn't always look like heroics. Sometimes it looked like teaching someone how to stand without fear. She tugged her coat tighter against the draft and approached room 14, the place where Margaret, a stubborn widow with silver hair the color of morning frost, sat gripping the bed rails as if the polished linoleum floor itself was plotting against her, her eyes carrying a quiet dread she'd learned to hide from her children, and as Sarah knelt beside her, she caught the faint tremor in Margaret's hands, the kind that tells stories about unspoken fears of losing independence, fears that gnaw at the soul more than any diagnosis ever could, and Sarah, who had spent years pretending her compassion didn't burn her from the inside out, told her in a steady voice that falling wasn't the end. It was the beginning of understanding her own strength again, and while the machines hummed around them like bored witnesses, she introduced the idea of 5 exercises, movements so deceptively simple they seemed insulting at first. But she explained them with the patience of someone who knew that small things were what kept people alive. Across the building, in room 19, Robert, a retired carpenter whose body still carried the geometry of his trade, sat alone listening to the radio static that seemed to match the crackling in his knees, pretending he wasn't afraid of the moment he'd try to stand and fail again. But Sarah saw right through that facade as well. And when she gathered Margaret and Robert together for the first time in the bright rehab studio she'd fought the hospital board to fund, the sunlight poured onto the wooden floor like a spotlight on reluctant heroes, the 2 older adults exchanging skeptical glances as if she were about to force them into a triathlon instead of teaching them how to reclaim their balance. Yet the first exercise, the humble sit-to-stand, became their quiet rebellion against gravity, Margaret gripping the chair with a comedian's dramatic flair, Robert smirking as though the universe had finally handed him something he could control, and Sarah, arms crossed, watched them rise inch by inch with the kind of pride she pretended was irritation, knowing full well that every successful lift was a sentence added to the story of their survival, and when they moved to the standing march, their feet tapping the floor like hesitant drumbeats, something shifted in the room as if the air itself rooted for them. Margaret finding her rhythm after years of letting fear dictate her steps, and Robert lifting his knees with the stubborn grit of a man who'd once built entire kitchens with the strength of his forearms. The side leg lifts came next, awkward and unglamorous, but strangely intimate in the way vulnerability always is, their limbs shaking, their balance wavering, and yet in the tremble Sarah saw bravery blooming where doubt once lived, the motions unlocking memories of dances at weddings, of chasing children across yards, of running toward buses they never quite managed to catch. By the time they reached heel raises, Margaret whispered something about how her late husband used to tease her for tiptoeing around the house like a cat burglar, and Robert muttered a confession about how he used to climb ladders without fear, though now the idea of standing on a curb made his stomach drop. But their bodies lifted anyway, calves burning, hearts beating with a renewed kind of defiance, and when Sarah finally guided them into the single-leg stand, the exercise that brought truth to the surface like a diver bringing treasure from the ocean floor, Margaret faltered. Robert steadied her without thinking, and Sarah felt a warmth rise in her chest that she quickly disguised as annoyance because tenderness, in her world, made everything hurt more. Days melted into weeks, routines forged into habits, and the clinic became a sanctuary for those trying to outrun their own fragility, Margaret arriving early each morning with her hair pinned in the same determined bun she wore when facing bad news, Robert bringing stale jokes and even staler snacks, the 2 of them transforming small victories into quiet celebrations, and as Sarah documented their progress, she noticed a strange thing happening in herself, something almost embarrassing, hope, the kind she'd tucked away after losing too many patients in residency, began creeping back into her bloodstream like a stubborn vine. One evening, after a session that left all 3 of them flushed from exertion and laughter, the lights flickered in the studio and the hallway outside went dark for a moment, not ominous. Just a reminder of how fragile everything was, and Margaret, leaning on her cane, turned to Sarah with a softness that made time slow, telling her that she hadn't felt this alive in years, that the exercises weren't just movements, but reminders that she still existed in the world, that she still mattered. And Sarah, who hated emotional conversations because they always stuck to her ribs like burnt rice, nodded and muttered something sarcastic about how she was just doing her job. But her chest tightened with that familiar ache that meant she actually cared. Meanwhile, Robert, trying to pretend he wasn't overhearing, wiped discreet tears from his eyes, the kind of tears that come from realizing you haven't given up yet even though you thought you had. And the next morning, when Sarah stepped into the lobby, she saw the two of them sitting together sharing a thermos of tea, their silhouettes framed by the rising sun, and she realized that the exercises had done far more than strengthen muscles. They had stitched together the frayed edges of two lives that had been quietly unraveling, pulling them back into the fabric of the world. As spring arrived and the clinic windows fogged with humidity, she ran their final assessments, her clipboard shaking ever so slightly as she recorded the improvements that exceeded even her cautious expectations. And when Margaret performed a flawless single-leg stand, holding it longer than any patient her age had in months, Sarah nearly dropped her pen, while Robert, ever the show-off, executed a sit-to-stand so smooth it made a nearby nurse gasp, and Sarah felt a ridiculous surge of pride that she would absolutely deny if confronted. When she gathered them afterward, telling them they had earned their independence back piece by determined piece, Margaret hugged her so suddenly that Sarah stiffened like a startled statue before awkwardly patting her shoulder, fighting the warmth rising behind her eyes. And Robert shook her hand with the restraint of someone who wanted to hug her too, but knew she'd combust if subjected to too much sentiment at once. On the final day, when the sun dipped low enough to cast gold across the walls, Sarah turned off the lights in the studio, running her fingers along the empty chairs, the mats still faintly warm from the imprint of the people whose lives had touched hers, and she let herself feel, for one fleeting second, that she had done something worthwhile, that the world, messy and unfair as it was, still allowed glimmers of triumph in places no one bothered to look. And as she stepped outside into the cool evening, she spotted Margaret and Robert walking down the path together, steady and upright, their shadows long and confident, and Sarah, hands buried in her pockets, muttered into the wind that she hoped they didn't trip on the way to the parking lot. But beneath the mock complaint was a pulse of fierce affection she couldn't quite smother, the comforting knowledge that sometimes healing wasn't a miracle. It was a choice people made one shaky step at a time, guided by trust, stubbornness, and the quiet belief that they were not facing the world alone.